Hello. I was watching a talk by a doctor in psychology, a New Zealand gentleman by the name of Paul Wood, and he was explaining his lead up to basically becoming the person who he is right now. And it was just a 15-minute talk, and it was amazing. He spoke about how he was a high school dropout and about how he ended up murdering someone who was treating him inappropriately. He was actually, the person who he murdered was a drug dealer, and so he was put into jail for 10 years. In jail he had an experience which opened him up to the fact that he didn't know what the world really was. You know, all of his previous ideas about what this world was all about were dislodged when he had this experience. And the experience for him was one which was really interesting. He was spending a lot of time in jail with a professional lockpick or locksmith, if you like. You know, obviously this person was put into jail for this reason, and they had quite a few conversations, I'm assuming many conversations about quite intellectual things, because both men were very smart. The lockpick one day came up to him in the yard where they were, out in the open, and he had a really heavy cigarette bowl in his hand along with a tennis ball in the other, and he said, "Which of these two do you think will hit the ground first?" And Paul said, "Well, that's a stupid question. Obviously the heavy cigarette bowl will hit the ground first." The lockpick dropped both, and they both hit the ground at the same time, and instantaneously he opened himself up to the realization that maybe the world wasn't what he thought it was. And so while he was in there, he started an undergraduate course in psychology, and he ended up completing that after getting off marijuana. And through getting off marijuana, he said these two things were impacting him the most with his studies while he was in prison. It was smoking marijuana, number one, obviously would it affect your ability to complete a university course, but number two, it was spending a lot of time in solitary confinement for misbehaving. And he said as soon as he got off the marijuana, he also spent a lot less time in solitary confinement. Go figure, right? It makes a lot of sense. And so he completed his undergraduate, but not only did he complete his undergraduate, despite the fact that lots of people gave him advice on the fact that he wouldn't be able to complete an honours degree in jail because he would have to be mentored and he would have to have face-to-face classes, etc. He had people come to him. You know, he's mentioned the time frame of 2.5 hours for some people to get to him to teach him, you know, these honours subjects. And he completed his honours while he was in prison. And when he got out, he was already 2 years into his doctorate of psychology. How amazing is that? Now, the really interesting thing was he was a high school dropout when he first went into jail. And in fact, he completed his first assessment in his undergraduate psychology degree completely in uppercase letters and one paragraph, not separated, one single paragraph for a whole assessment, completely uppercase. It's because he had no idea of any sort of writing conventions at all at that stage. Now, this man is a doctor in psychology, and he had just one of the most profound ideas that really hit me hard when he said it. He said that we all, you know, he's been in prison. He said we all create a prison for ourselves in our own minds. And he said that people who are in prison, they find a home there, they find a reason there, they find relationships there, they find the prison becomes their home. And I personally have heard the understanding that, or heard stories about people who have come out of jail and effectively died. They've slipped through the cracks in society because they had their home in jail and they spent so much time in jail that they didn't know what it was like to be free. They didn't understand. You know, they found their identity in that prison. And so when they leave, they don't know what to do, and they end up feeling worse out there. somehow in freedom. Doesn't make much sense, but that's how humans seem to be. And so he relayed that back to this idea that we create a prison within our own mind. A prison that we find meaning in. A prison that we feel at home in. And that's why it's hard to break through these perceptions of reality that we have. Because we feel at home, we find meaning, we find ourselves in them. But because they're a prison, they're not real. They're false. They're the opposite of love. They're fear. And although they feel homely, I must ask the question, how homely are they if we've got so many people trying to commit suicide? How homely are they if we've got so many people murdering? How homely are they if we've got so many people raping? How homely are they if we've got so many people feeling like you feel right now? And so it's up to us to break the shackles of those prisons. And although it's going to hurt a lot. It's worth it. Coming out the other side, you look at this man, Paul Wood, and he is amazing. He's a doctor in psychology. People come to him for advice. He's a life coach. You know, starting out in jail at 18, how amazing is that? Now, he would have had to go through enormous amounts of pain that he numbed with drugs, pain that he numbed with weed. I can't even imagine how much pain he was going through to need to numb it with that. It must have been extraordinary, but he overcame, and when he overcame, look what he became. And that just reminds me of a quote that I heard a while ago, and that is, what we can become is determined by what we can overcome, and only that. So whenever we come into a situation in our life where we start blaming people, we stop ourselves from overcoming it. We start putting the power out of our own hands, which is where it always is, in our hands, and we give it to someone else. But we're always responsible. Our perceptions are always our own, and we have the ability to change anything. First internally, through our perceptions, and then as our perceptions change, our actions change. And as our actions change, the way in which the material world interacts with us changes. Really, really amazing. Now, with the prison, he talks about we create a prison for our mind, and we find home inside that prison. I also had the thought afterwards, which I'm sure he would agree with, whenever there are prisons inside of ourselves, in our internal world, whether that be feelings or mind, feelings or thoughts, we create a prison outside of ourselves because that prison creates a perception, and that perception creates an action in this external world from our body, and that action causes the world to interact with us in a specific way. And so, when we act from a perception that's obtained inside a prison within our own selves, within our souls, that action will create a prison, somewhat of a prison. I mean, not everyone is in prison, of course. I think the more bound up we are inside of our own prison, you know, the more prisons that we have inside, the more faulty perceptions we have inside, the more likely we are to end up in an actual prison, you know, material prison. But I mean, people create prisons all the time. People create the prison of their relationship with their partner. People create the prison of relationship with their bosses. People create the prison of going to work. You know, that seems like a real prison for most people. And so the realization that these prisons don't have to be that. These prisons can be beautiful, can be amazing, and the walls of those prisons can crumble. But there's no way of making those walls crumble out here. This is the material world. We can't change it. It's inside of ourselves that we can change it. And when we change that prison, when we change our perception, the walls fall away. And when we change our perception, it changes our feeling. And from our feeling comes an action. And from that action comes a reaction from the external world. And when we start something positive, like Paul Wood did when he was in prison, he stopped taking drugs, he stopped going to solitary confinement, he started to study psychology. These disciplines that we put out into the world come back to us. They give us positive feedback. And so when this positive feedback comes back to us, it makes us more disciplined in every way, every way. And as we start becoming more disciplined, not necessarily for discipline's sake, but simply because of the reaction it causes in this external world, and the feeling that reaction from this external world gives us, this amazing feeling, we become more complete people, and we become more aware of what we want to be and what we really are, because we become enthusiastic. We become in God, meaning of enthusiasm, in God. And when we're in God, it's just indescribable. It's a different world. It's a different world to what the majority of people experience. And I know one day we'll get there, and we'll get there together. Thank you.